I am with the Huron Valley Democratic Socialists of America. And thank you all for coming out. I'm looking at my notes. We're here to have the discussion about fundamental problems with policing and why we do not need it. The work we've been doing locally on this issue has revolved around the proposed Ann Arbor Community Police Oversight Commission in coalition with other local groups, which you will hear more about during our discussion later. In case you had missed it, there's food and coffee and water out in the space behind us. And there's also more materials about the Democratic Socialists of America in the sign-up sheet if you want to get on our emailing list. And without further ado, I am proud to introduce Alex Vitale, author of The End of Policing, which I just finished reading last night. Alex is a professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. So without further ado, I'll sit down and I'll let Mr. Vitale speak.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. It happens that one of my best friends recently moved here to Ann Arbor, so I was looking for an excuse to come out to Michigan. And I'm giving some talks at Michigan State tomorrow, and I'm already making plans to be back here in April, so I'm hoping that we can continue this conversation in the spring. I have been watching from afar some of the work that's being done here about police oversight, as I do across the country as best I can. This is a very exciting time to be doing this kind of work. For those who don't know, I have been working on policing issues for over 25 years now in a variety of capacities. I was an organizer before I was an academic, and I think that influences the tone and the strategic direction of the book. It is a book that is written for organizers and for a more general audience. It's not an academic book in the technical sense. So I want to talk a little bit about police accountability and police reforms through a critical lens, and maybe ask some tough questions about the work that's being done here. I'm sure everyone has been paying attention to recent developments in Chicago with the murder conviction that came down against Officer Van Dyke. And there are people who take a lot of solace or even pleasure in this conviction. And there is a clear need for some kind of just outcome in these cases. But I'm not as enthusiastic about this outcome. Not because I think he didn't do it, or that there shouldn't be accountability or some kind of justice, but the idea that the path to changing the harms that policing produces is going to be achieved by throwing a handful of police officers in prison, I think there's absolutely no evidence to support this idea. So first of all, this is the first officer who's been convicted on these kinds of charges in Chicago in 50 years. So the very first thing that's going to happen is that within the police department, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion of bad apples. So that immediately, this officer is going to be let loose. And the claim will be, yeah, he got convicted because he went off on his own, went beyond what we normally do, and there will be a retrenchment around an idea that, yeah, see, when cops do really bad things, they do get convicted, see, the system works. There's no reason to think that that's going to significantly feed back into what the police really do. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is that the vast majority of police killings are lawful. Now, sometimes they get described as lawful but awful in the sense that they look terrible and the outcome is kind of tragic, but the legal frameworks within which policing operate permit a tremendous latitude in the use of deadly force. And that is a big part of why district attorneys, grand juries, and criminal juries refuse to take criminal action against police officers. So resting a lot of your hopes and energies into the idea that a handful of convictions is going to change policing rests on a legal framework that is not your friend, that does not view policing in the same way and does not create a space. Also, it misunderstands in important ways the actual harms that policing produces. It frames the problems of policing as these horrible but actually quite rare police killings that are unjust. Even if we include many of the lawful but awful ones, there are around 1,000 police killings a year. But there are millions of encounters between the police and the public. And even if we eliminated all of these lawful but awful and illegal killings, we would still have a massive problem of racially discriminatory and unjust policing in the United States. That has horrible consequences, mostly for young people of color in low-income communities. And fixing a few use of force requirements, slightly changing the legal standards, putting a few police officers in jail isn't going to do anything about that, in my view. This is also the problem with a whole set of procedural reforms that are designed to make policing more professional and less biased. Implicit bias training, community policing, a whole set of de-escalation trainings and use of force policy changes rest on the idea that the problems of policing are that too many police officers act in a biased or unprofessional manner, and that if they would just simply enforce the law in a racially neutral and professional way, that the police would have greater legitimacy, the public would have more respect for the police, and that there wouldn't be so much political tension around policing. But this rests on a kind of fallacy about the nature of the mission that we've given the police to enforce. That somehow a professional and unbiased war on drugs is going to be a just form of policing. But my argument is that a totally professional, unbiased, low-level drug arrest is still going to ruin some young person's life for no damn good reason. And making those arrests more racially balanced is in no way the solution to that problem. Getting the officer to speak to people more respectably before they arrest them for marijuana is not adding any justice to that system. Having school police officers treat the kids a little better before sending them to be locked up adds no real justice to that system. Part of the reason we're in this mess is that so many of the reform movement participants have adhered to the idea that what's needed is to have a neutral professional enforcement of the law based on this idea that respect for the law, neutral enforcement of the law automatically benefits everyone equally. So there's no interrogation, if you will, of what the legal mission is for the police. Only that the police follow that legal mission in a neutral way. But this is a fallacy. There's a great 19th century saying that the law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, begging in the streets, and stealing bread. But the rich don't need to do these things. only the poor do. And we've constructed a legal system in the United States whose outcome, if not intent, is to reproduce profound inequalities in American society. There's no way that we can think about the war on drugs as being anything other than an engine of reproducing racialized inequality in the United States. It has never had any public health benefits, public safety benefits. We can't point to a single statistical measure that has improved because of the criminalization of drugs. We have as many people in prison today for drugs as at any time in American history, and yet we have overdose rates running through the roof. Any high school kid in America can get any kind of drugs they want whenever they want them. I always joke with my students, if their grade depended upon whether or not they could get illegal drugs by the next class, is there anyone who would be at risk of failing? And they all laugh, you know. And these are the good kids. These are New York City kids who stayed in school, who did their homework, who, you know, got with the program, right? And occasionally one will, you know, start to raise their hand, and I'm like, really, you don't know who you would call to get the ball rolling on that? And they're always like, oh yeah, I know who I would call. Right? So, you know, they don't, we even have survey data about our students at very unusually low drug use and alcohol use rates among our students at Brooklyn College for a series of reasons, but they all know how to get drugs. So the war on drugs has always been a political project designed to expand the role of the federal government in law enforcement as part of a cynical politics of race that was about rolling back the gains of the civil rights movement. And it has produced unbelievable hardship for individuals, communities, enhanced overdose rates, deaths in custody, mass criminalization, because that was what it was designed to do. And the idea that what we need is to train narcotics officers to address their implicit bias is absurd, and is also about a political project of providing cover for a system that is fundamentally racist. Not because it requires that any individual police officer be racist, though when we look for them, we certainly find them, but it does not require that, because it rests on a legal framework that is about a racist politics. And so any system of reforms that's designed merely to make policing more professional and unbiased, but doesn't address the mission that police have been given, is, in my mind, doomed to fail. And the measure of success and failure can't be a 5% reduction in lethal police shootings. The measure has to be much more profound. It has to be, what is the impact on policing on the policed? And what we have today is a system where policing plays a major role in defining the political and social existence of entire communities as basically second-class citizens. When people are subjected to everyday harassment, when they walk down the street, drive in their vehicle, because of their race and or social class, that defines their place in American society. And a slight reduction in police shootings is not going to change that. Putting a few police officers in prison is not going to change that. Look at what's going on in schools, policing of schools. In New York City, we have more NYPD personnel in New York City schools than we have counselors of all varieties. And the whole reason that we have police in schools is based on a series of political developments that began in the 1990s. The super predator myth, which is invented out of thin air by deeply conservative criminologists who were motivated by a political program that was racist at its core, wanted to explain some high-profile youth violence incidents as being about the moral failure of the black community that would only respond to intensified policing. The Clinton administration fully embraced this, set aside tens of millions of dollars for a massive expansion of school policing. In the wake of that, the whole school reform movement emerges that is about a politics of austerity, of reducing funding for public education and turning it into a model of high-stakes testing in determining funding rates that has caused the hollowing out of public education through much of the country. Extracurricular activities, arts programs, counseling, all get wiped out. Everything is about teaching to the test. Students are bored, frustrated, not getting a high-quality, well-rounded education. They act out, but they also bring problems from home and the community into the school at a time when there are no resources to address those problems. And so what's the response? To bring in school police, to manage the disruptive students, to restore order to the environment. At the same time, they continue to cut counselors, continue to cut after-school programs. And so when there's a bad incident in the schools, the response is, well, we need to better train the officers, the school safety officers. We need to give them more equipment, more resources, more school police to make the schools safer. And my view is we don't need nicer school police. We don't need better trained school police. We don't need school police to be mentors to our children. We need no school police. What we need are properly funded schools, restorative justice programs, community schools models, better counselors who can provide culturally appropriate services to young people who bring a lot of problems into the school. That's the solution to our problems. And the solution to the war on drugs is not better trained narcotics officers and less biased narcotics officers. It's ending the war on drugs. So my advice for reformers is that they need to think seriously about campaigns that are designed not to produce technical changes within policing, but to get police out of the equation as much as possible. Police reform is about getting rid of the war on drugs. Police reform is about creating community-based mental health infrastructure so that we don't get armed police to show up when someone's having a mental health crisis. A quarter, at least, of all people in the United States killed by police are having a mental health crisis at the time they're killed by police. The response, well, we need CIT training and the Memphis model and these more money for police, more police response, instead of actually creating mental health services. And the only studies that show any benefit of those millions of dollars spent on training is that in those cities that implement these new training regimes, if they expand the availability of services so that police have alternative outlets for people, there are some improvements in the outcomes, fewer arrests, fewer use of force incidents. But my response to that is very simple. Why not just create the services instead of also spending all that money on police training? If we create the services, first of all, people don't have as many crises that require a 911 call. And second of all, there's no reason why we can't create an infrastructure of crisis response that doesn't rely on armed police. And while the system in the UK is not perfect and it's under assault, if a family has a family member having a crisis in the UK, there is a separate number to call that's tied to the National Health Service that has nothing to do with the police, and you get a trained mental health nurse practitioner who makes the response, who also has access to the medical history of that person, knows what their prior diagnosis is, what medications they've been on, has probably interacted with this person in the past. No one ever gets killed in the UK on a mental health crisis call. It just doesn't happen. They don't even have the concept of suicide by cop there, which is what at least 10% of all police killings in the US are suicide by cop. Someone having a mental health crisis who knows that if they wave something at a police officer, they will get shot. But in the UK, no one expects that outcome as even conceivable. So no one sets themselves up to be killed by the police. So here we are, we go full circle. What the police will say is, look at the shootings, that the vast majority of shootings. See, we didn't have any choice. That person was threatening us with a gun. That person was an armed drug dealer. That person was, a kid who brought a gun to school. But if we quit using police as the primary tool to manage every goddamn problem in the society, then we would not have so many police shootings. So what we have to do is we have to focus our energies on a real program for public investment in the kinds of things that actually are going to make our communities safer and healthier. And yes, along the way, we have to constantly point out the harms that policing and incarceration impose, and the need to shift resources from one to the other. But we have to quit investing our energy in technical fixes that rely on a legal system that is fundamentally unjust. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to introduce our other panelists and invite them to come up to the front. Sergeant Donovan Smith from the Collective Against White Supremacy here in Ann Arbor, and Alejo Stark from Rust Belt Abolition Radio and Michigan Abolition and Prisoner Solidarity. Here is that Alejo and Sarge have questions for Alex, and we can get a conversation going with you folks.
Or angry retorts are
or
also
something
welcome.
like that, yes. And after, I'll say perhaps half an hour, maybe taking questions from the audience.
Who wants to start?
I have sort of a question. I mean, at least in the narrative that you gave just now, you sort of tend to overemphasize the war on drugs. And I think that, the people that are locked up, only a quarter of them are actually locked up for any kind of drug-related charges. And so, and I think much has been done in relation to the drug war argument, particularly because Michelle Alexander's book, which is a great account of, a great but also I think incomplete account of why prisons have proliferated in the past 70s on. And so I wonder if you could maybe contextualize why emphasize the war on drugs as much as you have, and maybe contextualize in relation to other explanations of the expansion of the carceral state.
Great. So I want to go at this from two directions. One is to say that, first of all, I think if we're talking about policing, the drug war is of greater importance than if we just look at the incarceration rate, because it frames so much of how policing is done. There's a great book called Hunting for Dirtbags, and it's based on hundreds of hours of ethnographic research in two different cities, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. And what it found is that whenever police officers had discretionary time and they wanted to advance in their job, they went to wherever poor minority people lived and went around trying to grab people up for drug violations. And that this was also a great way to get overtime. It is so fundamental to the police worldview that they are at war with poor people and poor people of color in particular. Though I think it's important, and I point this out in the book, that if you look at a lot of rural parts of the country, this is not a uniquely, or it's not an entirely racialized phenomenon. There are lots of poor white areas where methamphetamines and heroin are ravaging these communities, and they also are getting a totally unjust war on drugs perpetrated against them. So that's the one side, is that for policing, I think it's of greater importance. The other is that that is not the limit of my analysis. So if you look at the book, there's, for instance, a long chapter about gang suppression policing that deals with the problems of youth violence, which in a lot of places is responsible for the bulk of violent crime. And in New York City, this is definitely the case. We've had these dramatic reductions in violent crime, but the violent crime that continues to exist is heavily concentrated in a small number of areas and involves a lot of young people. And some of it is this kind of tit-for-tat cycle of violence problem. But we can apply the same kinds of principles to addressing violent crime that we use to address school crime, the war on drugs, mental health policing. I propose in the book that we look at the kinds of community-based anti-violence initiatives, sometimes under the banner of Cure Violence, but credible messengers. There are various models and terms being used out there that we have to understand what's driving this violence. A lot of it is a profound insecurity among these young people that they are not safe in their communities. And despite the massive resources that we pour into policing, these young people are not safe. And so they carry guns, they form gangs, they walk to school together, they get in fights. Also, there's the way we define their violence as being somehow a sort of fundamental threat to society in a way that schoolyard fights in white suburban communities don't get defined that way. The zero tolerance, the intensive criminalization, the labeling people as gang offenders and giving them enhanced sentences, deporting them, the wide conspiracy cases that occur. So yes, we need to also directly challenge the way policing addresses problems of violence, not just the war on drugs.
Sarge, do you have any questions, or would you like to? No, sure.
So before I ask a question, actually, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background about who I am, for those of you who haven't met me. I'm a local grad student on a semester leave. I study higher education in West Africa. And I'm a community organizer in Ann Arbor. I've been here for about 2 years. But I want to point out that actually there's a quite deep network of community organizers in Ann Arbor, many of whom were invited to be on this panel, and they're all out of town, particularly women of color. There's a number of them in New York at a training with Mariam Kaba. So I'm here as a stand-in for a really deep network of organizers who I have learned from, not as a kind of speaker on behalf of organizing in Ann Arbor. And I hope I can do justice to some of the work that's going on. And then as Susan mentioned, lately what we've been organizing around is an ordinance for a police oversight board in Ann Arbor, which is an attempt to do some of the things that Alex has mentioned, and within, sort of like within the context of what looks like reform, to actually interject things that will bring power to communities, things that will bring really restorative practices to communities, will allow for sort of like power and accessibility. And maybe we're failing at that. Maybe the reform part is actually winning. But anyway, it's another conversation. So my question actually was, how, because you mentioned a few times in the book, the way in which this rhetoric of reform is working all over the country, community policing, for example, and it's amazing how fast, how quickly local politicians have at their fingertips this language of community policing, so quite quickly. In the case of Ann Arbor, they actually hired consultants. There are these firms that all over the country travel to police departments to kind of tell them how to talk about these things. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about kind of breaking the rhetoric of reform. Now, obviously, reading books like this does a lot to sort of unpack where this is coming from. But I found in the last 6 months or 8 months of organizing around this, that this language of reform is incredibly powerful for progressives and provides a sort of solid wall of defense for them against what they view as radical alternatives. And so I'm wondering if you have any examples of actually organizing around the country where people have either community-led education projects, organizing against police, where they've been able to sort of break down some of how this radical reform works, which is obviously to establish and cement a sort of very conservative way of governing or local governance. But we haven't had much success with that.
Well, I'm sorry that more of those folks are not here.
Yes.
Mariam is doing amazing work, and she and I are very much on the same page about a lot of this stuff, and we do panels together. And in fact, we're doing a big 2-day thing on Wednesday and Thursday in New York, and people are coming in. So I was just going to be tied into that, but I don't think so. Okay, so the diffusion of ideas that you alluded to. One of the big ways that this rhetoric of reform gets passed around is through the Police Executive Research Forum, which is made up primarily of big city police chiefs. There's also the International Association of Chiefs of Police, but that's dominated by the small sheriffs and local police chiefs because there's so many more of the small ones. So they created PERF to be mostly the big city ones, and PERF has a big research arm and a big policy arm, and they produce all kinds of best practices reports and documents. They played a major role in facilitating the breakup of Occupy by providing frameworks for labeling it as a public health problem and disseminating that, getting the big city chiefs on the phone together. And so PERF has been very central in promoting community policing as a reform strategy, and they have influence at the Department of Justice, which then puts money behind it, creates grant programs, and gets police to frame their reforms in a certain kind of language so that they can get additional resources. So what could be a problem with community policing? Don't we want the police to understand the community, to be able to tell who the bad guys are and who the good guys are, and to respond to community complaints? The problem is that community policing is really just a continuation of the politics of turning every neighborhood problem into a problem to be solved by police. It becomes the only part of city government that says, come and bring us your community problems. But what tools do they have to solve your problems? Handcuffs, ticket books, guns, threats. Those are not the kinds of solutions that we need. So I think the way we respond to community policing is to say things like, show me how community policing is solving problems in my community that doesn't involve putting